Hi, it's Kai, and this is Un-American. In Un-American, I invite international experts to share their perspectives on US-related issues and to add new angles to inherently American debates. Today, I'm talking to British-Australian media studies scholar Toby Miller about politics as entertainment and the commodification of news reporting. Toby Miller, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here with you.
So, as I've already warned you in the emails leading up to this, I want to talk to you about the relationship between the media, entertainment, and politics in the US. If I told you just 10 years ago in 2014 that the Republican National Convention in 2024 would star Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock, that George Clooney would play a part in facilitating the end of President Joe Biden's candidacy, and that one of the most talked about questions surrounding his successor's candidacy would be whether or not she would be endorsed by singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. Would that have sounded plausible to you?
Actually, it would have. It wouldn't have surprised me because we'd already had a certain Austrian gentleman as governor of the great state of California. We had had former B-movie actor and pitchman for cigarettes and refrigerators and former union president as president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. We'd had George Murphy, a song and dance hoofer from Hollywood in the Senate. And so there had always been a history of these folks getting involved in politics. And of course, if we go back to that very vibrant period in Hollywood, the so-called classical Hollywood cinema of the 30s and 40s, that many of us really love, that was a time of intense political polarization in the US, as is the case today. And there were plenty of people who were members of what people like me still call the party, which meant the Communist Party, in Hollywood. You know, hence the so-called blacklist, hence the requirement of dozens of leftists, mostly men, mostly Jewish Americans, having to come to Europe to work in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall leading a march on Washington to complain about this blacklisting. So there's actually a long history to it. At a certain level, what you say sounds preposterous. At another level, it's completely ordinary in US history, especially since the rise of celebrity with the rise of Hollywood a century ago.
That's interesting because, of course, what I was getting at is this a new thing that we are seeing right now, this symbiosis between entertainment and politics? And you would say it's on a historical spectrum.
Absolutely. That's not to say that it necessarily works in the way that Hulk Hogan or Taylor Swift or their advocates might think. If you look at the social science research on the effect of celebrities in US politics, the results aren't actually overpowering. These people are very successful when they are trying to sell coffee, take the example of George Clooney, whom you mentioned, or trying to sell beauty products or other things like that. When they switch to something ideological, they often lose the interest of their fans and customers. So there's not a lot of evidence that it actually works. Lots of these people are put in play by Greenpeace or other quasi-social movement activist groups to be the front person for campaigns about, say, the environment. It's successful in attracting the bourgeois media. They get column inches, as the saying goes. They get discussed in podcasts. They get written about in magazines. They get spoken about on television in ways that they might not otherwise have done. But this doesn't necessarily work in terms of getting ordinary people to change their minds about the climate. What it works at is in drawing more donors. Donors get interested when they see that there is media attention.
You got to be glad to hear, though, that that's only my, let's say, light entertainment into the whole issue of media and entertainment, because I want to look at it not through the lens of celebrity necessarily, which I do think is a very interesting way of looking at it. But as you say, I also feel like not very consequential in how people are ending up voting and how people are viewing politics. Because I actually got this idea for this episode from a slightly different angle. I got it by watching one of these CNN undecided voter panels, who I absolutely adore. And that was only a couple of weeks ago. And in that undecided voter panel, one of the undecided voters was asked about whether or not she would vote for Trump for a second term. And what she said really stuck with me. She said, whatever you want to say about Trump's first presidency, at least it was entertaining. Now, of course, that's very anecdotal, but it seemed like a very honest statement to me, and it really stuck with me for a while because it kind of instilled in me this fear that that's how more and more people might actually view politics in the US, as just another form of entertainment. Would you say that's an overly pessimistic take, or do you share that fear to an extent?
I think you're subscribing to the Frankfurt School there, and I can understand why. If we look back at who won the last presidential elections, the presidential elections since 1980, when Reagan won. 1980 and 84, Reagan wins against dishwater dull candidates. 1992 and 96, Bill Clinton wins against dishwater dull candidates. George W. Bush against, again, boring candidates, although he wasn't exactly charismatic. Barack Obama, charismatic. So there's certainly a sense in which that can play a part. But of course, no one would call Joseph R. Biden charismatic or entertaining, not just in the last little while when he's had this supposed deterioration in performance, but really throughout his career, partly because he had a speech disability. But he won because people had had enough of entertainment in the name of narcissism. And I guess one of the problems that Mr. Trump can face is the sense that he is doing all this not out of any real interest in politics. He's doing this out of an interest in himself. And that's one of the big distinctions, I think, between a charismatic and entertaining figure, which he assuredly is, as are some of the other men I mentioned, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, and so on, but without having any principle behind it. Now, one could argue against the principles that animated Clinton and Obama and Reagan. I certainly would. But nevertheless, there is, I think, that aspect that is different in Trump's case and is partly why he lost last time. Because along with the narcissism came chaos and disorder, something that Americans actually often don't like terribly much, even though they might say otherwise.
I like that you take my fear away a little bit, at least. Do you feel like there is some merit to the argument, though, that people are expecting politics to be more entertaining today than they did maybe 20 years ago?
Well, certainly more than they did 40 and 50 years ago. JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who won, in inverted commas, in 1960, through votes being rigged in the great state of Illinois, of course, was really the first, what we might call, to use an ugly adjectival form, mediatic candidates. But basically, successful candidates before, people like Truman and then Nixon and the two Bushes, were not charismatic. They were not particularly exciting or interesting people to listen to. And whatever else they stood for, well, and some of them were corrupt and were crooks and were monsters, they had policies that were clearly outlined and that had real impacts and that people could understand. Same with Lyndon Baines Johnson, who won overwhelmingly in 64. He won overwhelmingly in 64. Nixon won overwhelmingly in 72. Neither of them impressive on television or in debate, neither of them good looking, neither of them having the kind of personality that works outside the traditional smoke-filled room of the white guy running everybody else's lives. So I do think it is actually quite recent that that's become a really big factor in US politics. And I think it can come and it can go. So one of the things that Obama emphasized was not only I have lovely white teeth, I'm good looking, and I appear kind, but also I'm well organized. I know what I'm doing. I'm rational. I am not going to land you in hell like the Republicans just did through the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the global financial crisis of 2008.
So the role of entertainment in politics can come and it can go. And at the same time, there are certain ways in which politics and entertainment are linked and in which media plays a role in that. So I remember my earliest media studies classes in my bachelor's degree. and somebody who always came up was Neil Postman every time. And I still adore him because I feel like what he wrote in the 70s and 80s is still very much applicable today, and most of it is very accurate. And in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which you're probably very familiar with, he actually thinks about the role that the media plays in this, in linking politics and entertainment. And he writes, and I'm going to quote him, "What I am claiming here is not that television is entertaining, but that it has made entertainment itself the natural format for the representation of all experience. The problem is not that television presents us with entertaining subject matter, but that all subject matter is presented as entertaining." So in your eyes, what role does television, and I mean we can say today by extension image and video-based digital media, play in altering this relationship between people, politics and entertainment?
Well, first of all, a couple of comments on Neil, whom I knew pretty well because I worked at NYU, albeit in a different school from him. I didn't see the world the way that he did. He had been a very radical and important educational theorist in the 60s and 70s, who had then turned into this media expert. And there's a long line of people influenced by him. The book has sold millions, as you said. And I think Neil Postman took a very negative line about what audiences could, should, and would do with media meanings, was not abreast with some of the debates engendered by looking at active audiences, and was given to these immense generalities about the country. Now, of course, in conversations like the one that we're having, generalities are required. But one of the problems with the United States is that despite the vast amount of social scientific knowledge about it, people come up with huge generalizations that then impel how they run political campaigns without necessarily having proof that they work. So, for example, both parties are spending more money than ever before on old-fashioned television advertising in the run-up to the general election in November. Most of that is about local television advertising because, and this is how lots of local TV stations in the United States survive, because there's an election for the House of Representatives every 2 years and the general election every 4, and the parties pour in the money. This is how they think they can get at undecided or swinging voters. They still don't think that they can have confidence in the internet. They still don't think they can have confidence in door knocking. They can no longer use fixed line telephone services as means of doing scientific opinion polling. They're in the dark and they're throwing the dice up in the air and wondering where they land, despite the claims they might make to the contrary. So, yes, television matters a great deal in terms of trying to find those voters, but often critics, following on Neil Postman's distinguished example, overemphasize both the importance of, for example, the platform formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, and, for example, Fox News. Massively overemphasize the significance of these things. So, yes, I think entertainment and politics have always gone together, but no, I don't think we are in a phase where politics is absolutely dominated thereby. The US is home to the most sophisticated and complex public policy formations the world has ever seen. Lobbyists, think tanks, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Academics working on public policy, local activists working on public policy. Rationality, however much it might favor politics often that I don't like, is always in play.
I would like to dig in a bit deeper on how your argument differs from Postman, because Postman does describe television as this unique thing, as this image-based medium that has entertainment and only entertainment at its core. So you would disagree with that? You would say television can play an informative role? Is then CNN the same to you as the New York Times, if I may play devil's advocate? Or is there still a distinction to you between these types of media?
Well, remember, he was principally writing in the era of broadcast television. But now in the United States, there are 4 national broadcast networks. And of course, in addition, PBS and, needless to say, massive cable and satellite presence. He was talking about, in the days before there was a Fox network, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and they got all the ratings. It was just a matter of who was 3 points ahead of who else. And so you could argue that they ruled the roost, and you could make all kinds of statements based on the fact that they dedicated vast amounts of space and time to television drama, for example, and sports. But hey, Sunday morning, 9 o'clock, broadcast television, network television, Meet the Press, that kind of event, sets the scene for what the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, and the other networks, and Fox News and CNN and MSNBC do in the days to come. It is still the sounding point for these people to speak out. It's always been that way. So I do think television, yes, has a big entertainment function, but vast amounts of television are now not dedicated to drama or sports. They're dedicated to talk. Now, the talk might not be very informed, not very sagacious, not very useful, but it is about policy questions. Immigration, abortion, trans identity. These are real policy issues. They are the object of much debate on not so much network television now, but the cable stations, for example. So I just think it's a more complex scene than when he described it, even though, as I say, my problem with his interpretation all those years ago was that it left out the notion that the audience could be just the kind of self-critical and aware audience that German philosophy had imagined in the 18th and 19th centuries.
I want to contradict you a little bit on this because I find it interesting. You've mentioned a couple of things that I want to get into. You mentioned sportscasting, you mentioned network television. And while I do agree that there's, and we shouldn't forget about that, a vast availability of media to consume, I think my media diet is probably very different from somebody else's media diet, as in I'm getting online German news, I'm getting American news, I'm reading smaller magazines. So you can get a lot of information from very different sources, which I think is a great development. At the same time, what I find striking in that respect, as someone who's just moved to the United States barely 6 months ago, and my media diet is now much more American than it used to be, what really struck me is not only the content, but the aesthetics of American television, and especially American network television. Take the coverage of the presidential debates, which are very widely viewed and which are very, very popular. And a lot of people tune into that. So I'm not talking about the smaller cable programs. I'm talking about the big network events in television right now. And then on networks like CNN, ABC, Fox News, you will see the following. You will see split screens. There's 8 pundits chiming in at the same time. You see 60-second stop clocks on the debate answers that the candidates can give. You will see a coin toss before the debate, who gets to answer first. And I was thinking what all of that reminds me of is really not politics, but that aesthetic reminds me of sports journalism in a way, of pundits like standing around a football field, panel discussions resembling pre-game shows, daily opinion polls. There's like 1% today in Pennsylvania, 0.5 in Michigan, you know. It's like scorekeeping in a way. And if you listen to the ABC moderators actually before the last debate, you might actually think that you're at a football game.
Tonight, the high-stakes showdown here in Philadelphia between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Their first face-to-face meeting in this presidential election, their first face-to-face meeting ever.
A historic race for president upended just weeks ago. President Biden withdrawing after his last debate. Donald Trump now up against a new opponent.
The candidates separated by the smallest of margins, essentially tied in the polls nationally and in the key battlegrounds, including right here in Pennsylvania, all still very much in play. The ABC News presidential debate starts right now.
Now, I do see similar tendencies in Europe and elsewhere also, but I do feel like the magnitude of this aesthetic is so on such a different plane in the US. What makes this kind of gamification of politics so potent here? Do you even find that it's potent, or do you think that's just like one aspect of how the media represents this?
I think it's always been there in at least what we can see from the televisual record of the conventions that are held to nominate the presidential candidates. And they are like being at a football game or a basketball game or a baseball game, very much. They have been, you can see it in the footage going back right to the 1960s. In terms of what you say about the way in which the television tableau is set up, I think that's a very interesting and valuable point. If the baseball game is a blowout, if the basketball game is a blowout, if the NFL or hockey game is a blowout, where one team is winning all too easily, broadcasters are told, try to construct individual rivalries. Make it seem as though there's still something to play for. Bring drama to the story. Use statistics to talk about the money influence on the game, the issues to do with trading players, the future of the manager, and so on. Create some level of negativity. And so I think that that is important at the level both of what some people are seeing as a rise of potential neo-fascism in the United States, but also it is a stereotypical form of constructing difference in television, especially sports television.
I feel like one factor that cannot really be discounted in how we talk about the media and politics and political reporting today is really this change from the news to the 24/7 news, which happened, I guess, with the advent of cable television in the United States mostly, and with networks like CNN. How has this move from the news to the all-the-time news affected political reporting in your eyes?
I think we have to go back a bit further than that, if you don't mind my doing so, to 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes, which has been on television in the United States for close on 60 years. Hour-long show, still very influential, sometimes about politics, sometimes about personality, sometimes about social problems. It brought in advertising money in a way that no other factual program other than sports had ever done. And Don Hewitt, who was the first producer of 60 Minutes and was its founding parent, later said, I ruined the news. Why? Because for the first time, news was expected to bring in revenue, not to be a loss leader, not to be something that was done because of regulation through the Federal Communications Commission, which basically doesn't touch cable and satellite, but still touches broadcast and requires that local stations get their licenses based on serving their local communities, which means a broad swathe of programming, including news, local, regional, and national. Those stations suddenly thought this is something that should be making its own money. It must appeal to advertisers in a way that had not been the case in the first decades of radio and television news in the United States, and was not the case with the major newspapers, where they basically did not expect any particular section of the newspaper to be responsible for attracting revenue. Yeah. Plus, there were owners who believed in a notion of the public interest that went beyond making money. So with that transformation, news was expected by the 70s to bring in money. This was exacerbated by Watergate, which had huge ratings, people watching the hearings on all three networks that were private and on PBS day and night. I remember doing this as a teenager myself. And what then happens is that in the early 80s, there is the deregulation of television, along with the proliferation of cable and satellite, such that it becomes possible to create services that are what the Spanish call thematic channels. In other words, things that are just basketball or just politics. And this is when the 24-hour news cycle really comes into being, because we get first CNN and then its imitators in the shape of Fox News and MSNBC, that are not broadcast stations, that don't have this public service obligation and need to find fantastical stories. But when I lived in New York and I would be interviewed by CNN, I'd go into the studios and none of the journalists were watching CNN USA. They were all watching CNN International because they were actually interested in inverted commas, real news about other places. And instead, what CNN had become by the early 90s was a gossip station, and a gossip station that operated, again, via a conflictual model of knowledge, whereby there is a liberal position and there is a conservative position. These voices should both be heard. That gives you apparent balance. It keeps a certain number of viewers interested, and it makes conflict the basis of discussion. But it doesn't lead to serious debate about public policy. It's very orchestrated and very boring. And I know some people quite well who are pundits, right and left, on various networks in different countries, not just the United States, who are actually quite friendly with their apparently savaged opponent whom they wish to take down in debates, and who exaggerate their own views because that's how they can make money and become prominent. So there is a big problem here, and it arises initially from capitalism commodifying the news in a way that had never been the case, and then the deregulation of television and radio in the United States. And then this other tendency, which again gets us back, I guess, to a boxing or wrestling or pitcher versus batter or penalty taker versus goalkeeper model of conflict at the heart of so much of that news effort. So I think it's not so much getting stories 24 hours because they're out there. You and I watch Deutsche Welle. I watch it in English and Spanish. You watch it in German. We watch France 24, available in French, in English, and in Spanish. There's real news of great import 24 hours a day. It's not hard to find. Even the BBC manages to find some of it. So that's not the problem. The problem is getting back to the CNN story of what people weren't and were watching in the newsroom, the US fixation on the US itself, and this conflictual model matched with this commodification of the news as a new profit center.
I am still going to go into the 24-hour news cycle a little bit because I want to get to the commodification of news and of political reporting, especially in a second. Somebody who's talked about the 24-hour news cycle a lot and this need to report everything is not a media theorist like Neil Postman, but actually a TV practitioner, Jon Stewart, who I love to listen to on these issues because he's just worked in television and he does have a lot of insights that I find very striking. And one of the things that he recently said has really stuck with me.
There is more coverage with less news than I think I've ever seen. And that's been the progression my whole life.
And I do find that to be a very apt description of what we're seeing today in the US with regards to political reporting. If we take the Democratic National Convention or the RNC, there's pre-convention coverage, there's post-convention coverage, there's serious political journalists, not, let's say, entertainment journalists, but serious political journalists debating what is the candidate wearing, what might that mean today, and when might they arrive at the venue. There's a live ticker of, oh, Trump just arrived at the venue, Harris is now in the car, just to fill the time. It seems to me that that's drowning out substantial political reporting in a way. Of course, you can say it's still available, you have to find it, but in how far is this 24-hour news cycle and especially the media machinery that has grown around it responsible for drowning out deeper political analysis, at least on a quantitative level?
I think a lot. I mean, you just said it yourself, and the quotation from Jon Stewart, which I've not heard, is beautiful. He is very apt and very smart. My example would be, I'm a big football fan, as in association football. The fact that there is a struggle going on that you can hear on some podcasts and read in some, in inverted commas, serious journalism about the mass commodification of football. And there's a romantic view of the way Germany regulates football that says that this, which gives a certain purchase to traditional fans and not vulture capitalists, as per the English Premier League, should be the model for the world. I find these debates fascinating. When they creep into podcasts about football, people always apologize and say, sorry, we know that's all boring. Or when there are debates about what was called the Bosman ruling, so 30 odd years ago, freeing the, in a sense, serf-like footballers around the European Union from control by their clubs and giving them the right to go and work where they want once their contracts are ended. Now, those issues to me are absolutely fascinating, but instead, journalists in podcasts want to get back very quickly to why did West Ham win? What's wrong with, is something wrong with Bayer Leverkusen this season, right? And I think you could say the same thing about major US sports. Fascinating discussions to be had about the way they're regulated, the fact that they are basically regulated by the state as so in a socialist way on behalf of the billionaires who own the teams, so no regulation. The fact that they're regulated so that you can protect football, as in American football, by not allowing the broadcast of NFL games on Saturdays, so protecting universities as the free breeding ground of NFL players, thereby relieving the owners of the big teams from having to invest. All these stories are dismissed as boring, as opposed to the real story, which is about what happened on Sunday or Saturday or in the Champions League in the case of proper football. So these things are issues not just in news, but much more generally in the presentation by the media of the materials that they engage with. Not enough about the political economy, not enough about the culture of these things. So when they talk about what does it mean that Kamala Harris is wearing this kind of dress or this kind of pantsuit, I think that is quite interesting to lots of listeners. And there's something to be said about a presumptively male-occupied space, the convention hall, and in particular the debate stage, being occupied by women because of the traditional hegemonic masculine gaze at the female form that sometimes, of course, affects the way women see themselves as well.
Oh, I wish that's what the CNN presenters were talking about when they talk about the dress.
Well, exactly. And that would be what you would talk about, what I would talk about, or at least what would interest us, along with how much did all this cost? I think that's perfectly newsworthy and good, but you don't get it at that complex political, economic, and cultural level. Instead, it's trivia turned into something significant. So maybe I'm coming around to agreeing with you against myself, Kai.
I do want you to go a little bit more into what you've started talking about in your last answer, which was that you do see there's a big problem with the commodification of news. What do you think is the outcome of more and more money creeping into the media system in the US?
Well, you're familiar with the expression a news desert, which describes the deracination of local news in the United States. The fact that local news titles are closing every month and have been for years. Why is that? Is that because people aren't interested in what happens when they have a corrupt sheriff, or what happens when policies are made by local government that affect their roads or their water supply? No, it's because increasingly finance capital has moved into the ownership, in particular, of newspapers in the United States, and is interested in gutting them, selling their assets, and increasing their own profits. So we're seeing hedge funds becoming major media owners without the ideological commitment, whether you like it or not, of Rupert Murdoch, of Catherine Graham, that was at the Washington Post, of the Sulzbergers, the owners of the New York Times, right? Whatever their various political commitments may be, they're not just there for the money. They actually have certain ideological perspectives that they are wedded to. These guys aren't. They don't give a toss. They don't care. They're just there to make money, and they have gutted local news right across the US. And they put pressure all the time on all the entities in which they have financial interests, only to maximize income. In addition to that, the vast numbers of often very good journalism programs in the United States are increasingly turning out public relations practitioners, or what's sometimes now called strategic communication, because PR has got bad PR. If you do a journalism degree in the US, you won't get a job as a journalist, and if you do, it'll be poorly paid. You will get a job in public relations or organizational communication, and it'll be better paid. So there's a vast change both in the way in which local and other news gathering goes on to cut costs, sell materials, sell off plant and equipment and people, basically, and so on, at the level of owners and at the level of the labor process of people being forced not to work in public interest journalism, even if it is Murdoch defined, but instead to work in public relations for corporations. So I think that's where money is really gutting the US media system, along with the commodification that we spoke about before. Of course, all of this is a little bit in play.
So you and I would probably agree on the effect that money has on political reporting. I do find it interesting at the same time to look into the media and see how are the media and the people working in media actually rationalizing this effect of money. And I've started my career as a journalist in television, actually. I started working in ZDF, or Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, which is one of the biggest public service broadcasters in Germany. And back then, around 2012, there was a debate among the higher-ups of the network, actually, about whether the organization should start following the lead of private German TV channels that were then, again, taking the lead of CNN, and they were doing more and more of this attention-seeking 24/7 news reporting. Instead of the, I would say, rather serious, you could call it boring, NPR kind of political journalism that the public service broadcasters like ZDF were doing, and that I was interested in. I like the boring stuff, as you can tell by this podcast. and the simple reason was that more and more people were starting to watch the news on the private channels. So one might argue, as my higher-ups did back then, that that kind of entertainment news reporting was simply what the people were asking for. People were tuning into private news. What's your take on that?
It's a complex one, isn't it? Very, very complex. And many critics would feel the same way you did when you were working at the station, that this is chasing after, and this sounds snobbish, lowest common denominator ratings. The idea that there should be something uplifting and educational about, in particular, public media.
And it has a name in Germany, I might add. It's the Bildungsauftrag, the education mission that public broadcasters have, which should be their central mission and not the ratings.
Well, John Reith was one of the first directors general of the BBC, and he had this notion of to educate and to elevate, and to entertain, bring these things together. And you can see that really throughout Western European public broadcasting, still today, at least elements of it. And the trouble is that then runs into accusations of elitism. You're only speaking to your own class. You're not capable of addressing what ordinary people are interested in, and so on. Conversely, and this is the problem the BBC always faces with Rupert Murdoch, if you do chase audience numbers and get them, which the BBC does, capitalism hates you because you're taking away viewers, which diminishes their advertising revenue, right? So public broadcasters are always caught on the horns of this dilemma, at least in my experience. Don't have small audiences or you're just catering to an elite. Don't get big audiences or you're stealing away through massive public investment what should rightfully be the terrain of competition for commercial interests.
And that's a bleak realization in a way, especially when you talk about the United States, because the United States does not, to that extent, have even public service broadcasters who might act a little bit differently, even if they don't.
Well, it's a complex story because when it was begun, the idea was very much through the Ford Foundation, which provided seed funding, to create a national network based on what would be new but also existing local college town university radio and television stations, and to a certain extent independent ones. And this was very much about trying to do something about African American revolts against racial inequality in the country. And the idea that Ford and various others involved in the creation of what became the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Public Broadcasting Service, elements that emerged from the Great Society reforms of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the mid-60s, had in mind. And that's why things like Sesame Street were made from the Children's Television Workshop in ways that could, it was thought, reach out to the urban racialized proletariat and bring them into a notion of US unity, right? In ways that it was thought commercial television failed to do, because commercial television only sensationalized racial divisions and didn't simply engage them as part of the social world of the country. So it was always marked by that, but regrettably, within 5 years, Richard Milhous Nixon, who won the 1968 and 72 elections, wanted to gut public broadcasting because he saw it as a place for intellectuals, Jewish people, African Americans, the left, and the young, groups for whom he had no time, to criticize what middle America, his great expression, wanted. So in this, it has a different history in the US, as it does really right across the Americas. Whereas in Western Europe and in wealthy countries in the Asia-Pacific region and some parts of Africa, public broadcasting was there first, and then commercialism was allowed in to a greater or lesser extent. And public broadcasting had big centralized funding sources. In the United States, that was meant to be the idea, but it came along too late. It came along at the first moments of the fiscal crisis that's really dogged the West for the last 50 years, and also at a time when Republicans gained power and wanted to get away from what they saw as providing alternative voices and outlets.
Against this background, what I find equally threatening as the news not doing their job very well in political reporting in many ways, is that I find lately that it seems to me that politics has, over the past years, come to understand how it can use that weakness of media and of news reporting and turn that logic back around on the journalists in a way. Let me make that a bit more tangible, maybe. To me, it's like CNN started this whole process of the entertainment news by saying, in order to make politics more entertaining and easier to sell, let's say, or more palatable maybe, you, the politicians, you will only get 120 seconds in your debate answer to explain to us even a very terribly difficult concept like healthcare. And I do think the political establishment had to grapple with that for a little bit, but I feel like now they are saying, you want a 120-second answer, you get a 120-second answer. And in fact, thinking about it, we're quite happy as politicians that journalists are not asking us to explain our policies anymore. So have at it, but don't expect me to get into complex issues or explain my politics to people. And that does in a way confirm to me a prophecy that another media scholar has made, even earlier than Postman, Marshall McLuhan, who I'm also a fan of. And he said, politics will eventually be replaced by imagery. The politician will be only too happy to abdicate in favor of his image because the image itself will be much more powerful than he could ever be. And in that way, I also find it very ironic right now in the US elections that you hear a lot of pundits on CNN and on other channels complaining almost that there's a lack of policies being discussed. You hear this a lot right now in American news saying there's not enough policy. People are not discussing enough policy. Why is Harris not going into her policies? Why is Trump not getting into policy, which I never expected him to do, but whatever. When it's the very media machinery itself that has encouraged politicians to evade that substance. Do you find any truth in the analysis that the media, which is supposed to hold politicians accountable, in my view, is now being exposed by politicians to an extent in that way?
No, I think that's certainly at least partially true. The other thing that I think is very relevant is the media training that politicians now receive. And you may well have either engaged in this or been a victim of it as a reporter, where you only answer the question that you wish had been asked. And you don't really answer the question that's been posed. So I've come here, I've been given some talking points by my handlers. God damn it, I'm going to stick to those. It doesn't matter what you say. Volunteer nothing, only give the following bits of information, right? Now, one of the things that frustrates Trump's handlers is that he doesn't do that either. But of course, he doesn't go in depth into policy at all. He simply rants about what interests him at the time in the context of this negativity about the country. So he does, in one sense, have that consistent message. So I think the problem is not so much answer this in 120 seconds. It's rather the media training that says, don't answer anything unless it's the question you wanted to receive.
I want to stick with Donald Trump for a second, even though I really despise talking about him too much. So I'm only going to devote one question to him. Because I find that he's both a creation, funnily enough, of the mainstream media, and he's ultimately also the one who's exposing their brand of reporting in a way. So they turned politics into entertainment in a way. And they ultimately got an entertainer into politics who doesn't really understand much about politics, in my view, but who does understand a lot about how the media works, how to create headlines, how to get attention, and how to make that attention work to his own benefit in a way. So he's someone who does not distinguish between good news, bad news, but he just sees the attention factor of it and the entertainment factor, and the money and the power, I guess, that he can gain by it. And now the industry that has helped him into politics doesn't really know how to handle him anymore. Even though in the wake of 2016, CNN and other channels, they've repeatedly vowed to do better in reporting on him.
I think to the degree that the media had lessons to learn in 2016, they seem to have been learned.
It's irresponsible for cable news networks to give Donald Trump hours and hours of free airtime.
Way too much speculation and liberal wishful thinking and attempts to connect dots that did not connect.
It's the media's responsibility to not get distracted.
I think we were much too busy chasing after shiny objects.
All of us have learned some very valuable lessons from the last couple of years in delineating what's significant, what's important.
Despite these pledges, though, and that shows again in this election cycle, the corporate media can't tune out of Donald Trump because giving him attention is making them money, right? It's the entire business model in a way. Is there any way of breaking out of this cycle in your mind? Or would that take the literal tearing down of the entire media system and building it back up in a different way?
In 2017, Leslie Moonves, who was the head of CBS and is now in disgrace over unproven sexual harassment charges, said, Donald Trump may be bad for America, but he's good for CBS. We made a lot of money out of him. And this is, without a doubt, a major problem in US news media. However, to give some historical perspective, the idea that we should romanticize the mostly straight white guys who have been the key reporters in the history of US journalism is, I think, misguided. It was very clear to everybody on the left in 2003 that there was no proof that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction, that this was a bald-faced lie concocted by the British lapdogs of the United States and the US security establishment itself, even though significant aspects of that establishment realized this was not true. And yet, this was repeated day after day after day after day as being true everywhere in the US bourgeois media. The one holdout was bits of MSNBC because it had already tried to construct itself as liberal. The recently deceased Phil Donahue had a program at that time in which he constantly countered the thread of lies that was being woven across our minds, and he was soon sacked by MSNBC despite okay ratings. We had attempts to promote the truth defeated because advertisers literally would not provide income to stations or other media outlets that were prepared to print the truth. But we also had vast numbers of journalists at the New York Times and the Washington Post in these supposed halcyon days, a golden era of journalism, printing lies, simply recirculating nonsense from the State Department, nonsense from the Pentagon, nonsense from the White House. And when it was disclosed about a year later that no weapons of mass destruction had been found, this was barely reported by any of these outlets. And the same with the major networks. So there was no golden age of wonderful journalism that has been corrupted in the recent past. It's always been deeply problematic.
Now, you have moved on, and I'm going to take you right back to the Frankfurt School, which you have mentioned before, which is kind of funny. And I'm going to take you right back to Theodor Adorno, who said, es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen, meaning there's no right life in the wrong life. And it expresses the idea that you can't have a morally good life within a fundamentally flawed society, more or less. Would you follow that same logic? Because now we've talked in very skeptical terms about the media, and I feel like I have even slowly pulled you in my very skeptical and depressing direction. Would you follow that same logic regarding our current media system? Is there no good news within a fundamentally flawed system? Or do you have a more optimistic take for me, just to get into slightly optimistic territory?
I think there is ground for optimism. If we go back 200 years, perhaps 12% of the world's population was alphabetic, could read and write. If we go back 60 years, it's sort of 40%. Now it's well over 60 or 70%. What do people read once they can read? They read about sports, the weather, the economy, culture, politics. They read journalism. This is the golden age of journalism. Not in terms of the financial opportunities for reporters in the global north, but across the world. Readership is increasing massively. What do they visit? Guess what they visit? The BBC World Service, where they can read and listen to things in their own languages, CNN International, Deutsche Welle, France 24, Al Jazeera, The Guardian. The numbers of people reading The Guardian dwarf anybody ever watching Fox News. There is massive interest in what genuine public interest and sometimes public sector reporters come up with. It matters in ways that are invisible if you look at how many 70-year-olds watched network news last night on NBC. Secondly, there are some great models of journalism that are independent of the state. Not everybody has a thing like the Scott Trust that keeps the Guardian going, but are doing well. I think of Mediapart in France, which, as it says, is owned by its readers. You subscribe, you can read everything that's written online and published, and you can have a say in what the news stories are. It's a very interesting subscription model. Salto in Spain, which is pretty much free to read. Also Público in Spain, pretty much free to read. In the case of Salto, extremely international, very progressive in its orientation, producing writing that can be both personal and driven by data, but is not, in my opinion, boring and not failing to be up to date. In Mexico, La Jornada, which is where the revolutionary groups of indigenous peoples in the 1990s got a hearing, where their, in inverted commas, leader or spokesperson, Subcomandante Marcos, white guy, philosopher influenced by the Frankfurt School, would write stories, both fiction and non-fiction. There are pockets, and you could name them in other countries, of incredibly interesting, progressive, smart reporting that is very interested in what its readership wants, what its audience wants. The BBC's World Service has to show that people are listening to its Latin service, its Arabic service, its China service, right? Its Farsi service. So audiences matter, but they're not driven just by money. They're driven by a quasi-abstract notion of the public interest. And it's often much better than the domestic version. I think the BBC domestically is massively overrated, but the BBC internationally is terrific. And the same applies to, France 24 is much better than the domestic French TV news outlooks. You can get wonderful work still being done, and it's happening, and it happens in alternative outlets in the United States, all over the country. The Pacifica Radio Network would be only one.
Against that background, I'm interested. I'd like to know if you can share, how your own media diet looks like and how you talk to your students about media literacy and news consumption. How do you keep yourself informed but not numbed by the political news coverage?
I don't think I'm capable of doing what you did, which is having a week's holiday where I don't follow it, even though it's probably like a soap opera where you can stop watching for 12 months and resume. The faces may have changed, but the stories and the characters, not so much. So, when I get up in the morning, I read the BBC International News feed, and I read The Guardian obituaries first.
Give me an insight into why you read those.
It's about being of a certain age, old thing. It's also where you get some of the best writing, because generally they've been written and sub-edited, copy-edited within an inch of their lives over some years. So they're often very well put together. And they can be idiosyncratic and interesting. And then the news and the sports. The Economist, which I subscribe to, because whilst it's neoliberal in its orientation towards the labour process, it's anti-fascist, it's pro-environment, it's pro-feminist, it's pro-immigrant. So it ticks boxes for me. And unlike, say, something like The Nation or Mother Jones, both of which I admire, it has the resources to do reporting. My problem with much oppositional journalism in the US, which I was just briefly lauding, is that there's too much opinion and not enough fact-finding. I know why the resources aren't there, but it's a problem. Whereas The Economist knows how to find things out. And then I read some of the things I mentioned, Deutsche Welle in English and Spanish, France 24 in English, French, and Spanish, and Salto, the Spanish newspaper. I read L'Humanité, which is the Communist Party newspaper in France, and Libération, which is the pseudo-leftist one, and Nouvel Observateur, pseudo-liberal. So that's a fair bit to go through, but of course I don't read everything in them. And the good part of that is that I get both an Anglo worldview, understood broadly, and also a European worldview, understood broadly. Plus, I read rebellion.org, which is an international cosmopolitan news digest from leftist voices all over the world in Spanish. In terms of what I say to my students, it depends on who they are. When I taught in New York and New Orleans, I was teaching children of the ruling class, white children of the ruling class, who had been coached within an inch of their lives very successfully. And so in class, they might be looking at influences on fashion and makeup or sports betting suggestions or actions on their phones throughout the class, to the point where I would feel lost and unhappy. My strategy was to try to pick up on what actually interested in them, to make the points that were generic to me more fully. So I found out about the labor process of influencers. Who makes most money? Who doesn't? Guess what? In the United States, over 80% of influencers are women, and they make peanuts compared to the few men who are involved in it. Big difference between Europe and Latin America versus the US. In the US, most influencers are people who are famous for being influencers. In Europe and in Latin America, they're football players. They're Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, or Neymar, or they're singers. So how could I make points about political economy and culture, drawing not on US wars, US racial discrimination, environmental injustice, influencers, and sports betting? So meet them where they are. And it wasn't condescending because these were children of the ruling class. I'm not. In the case of when I've taught poor students, different story. When I've taught in Mexico, mostly indigenous students who are living at home, 9-person family, 3 rooms, no Wi-Fi. I was teaching lots of them during the first 2 waves of COVID-19. Many of them had black market oxygen tanks next to them to stay alive during class. There, they have deep respect for education, profound interest in research, hunger to learn, lots of really relevant life experience, and most of all, no sense of a transactional relationship to learning. So during one of our classes, the rebellion in DC on January 6th, 2021 occurred. They didn't know it was occurring. They didn't know what the electoral college system was, any of those things. They wanted to find out. They thought it mattered. And it mattered because of their vision of the United States as a beacon of democracy, however bizarre that might seem to many of us. So my answer is, I have a fairly broad diet, but a lot of it is football, I have to confess. And I have an obsession with podcasts. I listen to the same companies I was talking about, DW, France 24, the BBC, all their podcasts pretty much. And when it comes to students, the big thing for me is, what is their class position? What is their cultural capital? What is their racial and gender formation? What interests them? How can I turn the theoretical, methodological, ideological commitments that I have into something that's palatable, in the context of their concerns, and they can then reject or adopt as they wish. I always say to them, I'm a socialist. You can get an A in this class while being the biggest capitalist of all time. I just want you to listen to the interpretation that many others and I can give you of the things that drive you.
This is leading right into my last question, because given that we just talked about the corporate media and politics for a while, which can be a bit straining and depressing, as we've demonstrated, I do want to end on a lighter note, and I do want to end with your students, funnily enough. And I specifically want to address anybody who's considering to take one of your classes in the future, because while preparing for this interview, I came across an online comment of somebody who has apparently taken one of your classes and felt compelled to warn future generations by publishing the following post. Make sure to listen to all the podcasts as well, ! Because they might be coming up in the finals. So I'll give you a chance to come clean here and drop a little hint for your future students. What are the chances that this podcast is mandatory listening next semester?
As someone from the upper Midwest or potentially just over the border in Canada would say, yar you betcher.
Toby Miller, thank you so much.
Thank you.